Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another buddy fight video. Today I'm going to continue the topic of budget decks for buddy fight, and in today's example I'm going to be using Drametals because they are a pretty solid budget deck and have definitely a good amount of options to build with and a solid path to upgrade into. Basically, just as a quick rundown as far as what the deck is doing, it is utilizing the Oppress mechanic, which is the ability to control the opponent's left and right zones, and basically you act as if those zones were your zones with the monsters you're placing in them. That creates a whole bunch of unique board states, and based on the cards you are using to oppress with, it can have a whole bunch of different effects depending on the ones that you're using. Ideally, you're going to want to run about 12 cards to oppress with, so that way you have a couple of different effects and abilities to go off, and then you're going to have a couple of cards to interact with the fact that you're oppressing. And then as far as your spell package goes, you're just going to be running some very basic draw cards, you're going to be running a couple of different offense and defense cards, and then you're going to run an item and an impact or two just to round the deck out. So it's just a very basic deck, but it's still very, very effective. But deck building could be sometimes very hard and daunting for people. So as far as what I like to do for deck building is I will utilize search engines to help find particular cards that I'm looking for. I know that Drametals, as an example, is going to be using the Oppress mechanic. So I'll go into a search engine and then I'll look for, under the effects, Oppress, and then if I'm looking for monsters with Oppress, I'll just change the filters to monster and I'll find cards that I'm looking for. So obviously, Lost Knight Neurolancer is probably going to be one of the best cards to oppress with. Only problem is he's really, really expensive. Because I'm trying to operate on a budget, I'll tend to ignore the really, really expensive cards. So here's another card that can oppress because he has the oppress mechanic, and he has a really solid effect when he's oppressed. So I'll either jot him down as a potential option or put him into the deck and go from there. So I'll just do this for basically a whole bunch of different mechanics and a whole bunch of different cards. So the first one was obviously Oppress, and then usually one of the more common things I'll look up is like draw spells in the particular worlds that I'm playing in, and I'll see all of the options available to me. Because sometimes the options just don't really apply because we're not able to use the card, but sometimes they are able to apply, so that's something I definitely would consider. And then sometimes you'll just find some really unique cards based on some of the things that you're looking for. So just by reading the cards and looking at some of the Oppress cards, I know that obviously Emperor is going to be in my center, and he doesn't have the Oppress ability, but he interacts with Oppress. He will reduce his size by 2, which makes him a size 1. Well, looking at all my other Oppress cards, they're all size 1s. So that leaves 2 empty slots on my left and right, able to utilize a size 0. So I'll first search up in like a search engine, size 0s for Star Dragon World. And then I'll not necessarily look at all of them individually, but I'll look at some of the ones that might apply more towards the deck that I'm using. So as an example, they have a size 0 Drametal that interacts with Oppress. So that would be like the first card that I would consider. And then I would also look to see some of the other Oppress cards that I'm currently using before whittling cards down. So I know that Gallomace has the ability to oppress, and he gives my field a power and defense buff when he oppresses, or as long as he's oppressed. So I know I'm looking for some sort of stat buff or debuff that's a size 0. So I found Jewel Frill, which is a size 0 that debuffs the opponent's field. So because she exists, I don't necessarily feel like I need to run this, but I still have the option to run it if I want to. So I could run 2 of this, and I could run 2 Jewel Frill if I really wanted to. But just to keep things simple, I'm just running 4 Jewel Frill because I feel like she has a lot higher synergy than Pawn does. Because Pawn's ability only triggers when the Oppress card is destroyed. Well, we don't want our Oppress cards to really be destroyed. So I feel like while the effect is really good, I would rather just try to keep my cards around, and she interacts with the opponent's center, which is ideally the only zone you really want to let your opponent have access to. So she just has some slightly different and I feel like higher synergies, but I wouldn't have found her if I wasn't searching for various other cards to use. Because now that I have her, I don't necessarily need these two, and because I don't need Gallowmace, that frees up a slot for cards that I'm going to be oppressing with. So that way I could utilize some better or different cards. Not to say that Gallowmace isn't bad, it's just now I have a card that does something similar to it without needing it to be oppressing. So that's just kind of how I do a little bit of deck building. I'll just have a giant list of cards and look to see what cards are going to fit what roles best. And then I have just a few minor deck building rules to try to ease my ratios. So as like an example, if a spell says once per turn, I'll usually start with running 3 of it, and if I really need to see more of it, then I'll up it to 4. And same thing with set spells. If a set spell says you can only have 1 of it set on your field, I'll usually start with 2, and then I will up or down it depending on what the rest of the deck is doing. So that's just kind of how I deck build. Just one big list using search engines to search for a whole bunch of different cards, and then I'll just whittle it down for it to eventually be a deck. But Drametals is definitely a really fun and interesting deck because they definitely have a lot of good options available to them. So that's kind of all I really have on this video. As always, I'll have the deck list in the description below. Feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions about the deck or questions about how to build decks, or if you just want to leave a comment in general. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe for more Buddy Fight content, and I will see you in the next video.